Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
That a lot of people didn't understand too in the conversation was that science doesn't actually have a definition of what human is. There's an immense amount of disagreement among scientists. It's something we care about. It's important, and it's certainly important in theology, but science doesn't really have a definition. And you can't really answer basic questions about like when humans arise or how they arise without actually having a good definition. So that adds a fundamental indeterminacy to what science is telling us that made an immense amount of space for theological reflection and progress. That, I think, has ended up really shifting a lot of the lines in the origins debate and creating a lot of opportunity for a lot of good things to happen.
My name is Pablo Salmones, and I will be your host for today. This episode is an interview with AI and Faith advisor Joshua Swamidass on the impact of AI on Joshua's field of health and genetics research. Joshua is a scientist, physician, and associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. During this episode, we will discuss the promise and risk of AI in gene-based medicine, the potential for emergence of artificial general intelligence and its consequences, and how Joshua's faith informs his approach to medical research. He's a computational biologist, physician, academic, and author. He's an associate professor of laboratory and genomic medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. He's published over 150 articles, and he's a rising star in the area of faith and peaceful and science with his Peaceful Science blog. And his recent book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. Dr. Swamidass was recently elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for his distinguished contributions to the field of deep learning in computational biology and for extraordinary public outreach promoting an understanding of science among communities of faith. AAAS is the world's largest general scientific society and publisher of the science family of journals. Election to be an AAAS fellow is among the highest honors in science. So, that's just a brief description of Joshua's work I took from the Iowa State University website, where you actually gave a conference a few weeks ago, you mentioned via email. So, Joshua, as the first question, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, we have experts here, but many experts are from like different fields. So just so that we can start, what exactly is computational biology and what exactly is deep learning in computational biology?
Yeah, that's a good question. So computational biology is a fairly recent field. I really got drawn to it when I found out about it first in undergrad in the 90s. And I really liked computer programming, but I was a pre-med and liked biology too, didn't know how to put them together. And it was really, I think it really became a major discipline because of the Human Genome Project, when biologists really first realized, oh, maybe we're going to need some people with other expertise than, mixing chemicals to understand all this DNA stuff. And so it's a field that's very broad and it's eclectic. It deals with really computational problems that biologists and chemists are, encounter and are dealing with more and more in medicine as well, too. You also asked about deep learning in that. Early on, long before deep learning was called deep learning, when it was just plain vanilla neural networks, I was working on that angle, but that was like in the early 2000s. I studied under a leading neural networks professor for my PhD. And I saw a lot of potential in that particular connectionist approach, opposed to a lot of the more dominant methods at the time. And that bet ended up being really the right bet. So even when I started my professorship in about 13 years ago at WashU, most people were skeptical of neural networks and thinking other methods were really going to be better. And it was definitely, an argument that had to be made back then. And then now, as everyone knows, that's just not the world we live in. There was a big transition that happened maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where all of a sudden I was no longer really arguing that this is an effective approach that can be helpful. It was much more educating my colleagues on how they could do it too, and explain. So it's been a really exciting time to be in this particular niche of the conversation for so long.
Yeah, no, and precisely about this broad perspective that you are saying, like, yeah, we're going to need people like from different disciplines that you were saying when you first started answering the question. Within peaceful science, I read some of the articles that you have there, and obviously some of the like all the values that you hold most dear, and everything else, and that seems to be like a very interesting approach. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about what peaceful science does, and particularly the name peaceful science, perhaps with an extra element for your consideration. Well, as David mentioned, I live in Mexico City, and earthquakes are very common here, so well, not every day, but every once in a while, we do feel when the boundaries are being pushed by the tectonic plates. Well, we do feel the ground moving below our feet. And it seems to me that some of these new, for example, in computational biology, that you were saying that it's a fairly recent field, and obviously with all that's being happening in the AI field, I wanted to ask you peaceful science within that context, because I think that many times, every single time we push the boundaries of science or technology, there's, just like in an earthquake, a bit of violence inherent to it, right? So I wanted to ask you about the name itself, of course, and how you see peaceful science within this moving environment.
Yeah, so peaceful science has really been an effort of me and a few other scientists and scholars to really try and find a better way forward in places where there's been a lot of conflict between science and faith. We are really most known probably for our contributions to the origins debate, which I think in a fairly short amount of time has really kind of turned that conversation upside down in really exciting ways. It was like a really stagnant conversation, which was really defined by lines of conflict. But now there's just been a lot of movement happening. We don't know where it's all going to end up. But a large part of that was through us just really doing the crazy thing of getting people together from different points of view. Mm-hmm. That actually had expertise in theology, had expertise in exegesis, had expertise in population genetics and in anthropology, and to just actually talk to understand one another. And then realizing that an immense amount of the conflict really was just profound categorical errors and misunderstandings across those disagreements. And we were able to make a lot of progress by clearing that up.
Yeah, and precisely about that, and about your book, the genealogical, sorry, I always have difficulty pronouncing that word.
The genealogical Adam and Eve.
Genealogical, yeah. Sorry, the genealogical Adam and Eve. I find this, and one of the reasons I think also makes AI and faith great is precisely bringing people from different disciplines. And I think it's a very brave thing to do, actually, to try to bring people from faith and science together. It wasn't always so, like throughout history, it wasn't always so, it was, but right now that there is a much more hyper specialization of things, it is very brave to do it. So can you tell us a bit about what you defend in the genealogical Adam and Eve, and this reading of the biblical story of Adam and Eve and how it connects to science?
Yeah, I'll do that. But I first want to just give a bit of context of why this is important for AI, if that's helpful. First of all,
please. Yeah.
I think there are some important lessons that we as a community of scholars trying to engage with AI and faith can learn from what's happened in the origins conversation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And I want to put a name to a couple of what those things are. And then if I explain what happened in my book, it'll make a little more sense in that larger context. Okay. Okay. I think. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, it's perfect. Please go ahead. Yeah.
So first of all, I think that in origins, there was a tendency for religious communities to be very reactive and take kind of negative response to things that they didn't really understand all the time. And that just really fed into itself for like 150 years on the topic of origins and evolution, right? And wouldn't it be great if we could avoid that when it comes to AI? It would be great.
Yeah.
And you can see examples of that type of reactivity happening, I think, in many contexts where people who don't really understand it take an overly negative view of it, or not that there isn't things to be concerned about and to be negative about at times, but I think one thing that we can want to be aware of is how do we kind of have that role of being people who are more informed in the church or the mosque or the synagogue, and really helping the public go down the path of understanding rather than reaction. That's one. Mm-hmm. And then two, when I think about how when things really did get bad in origins, what we were able to make progress on, I think this is a book that I wrote, but this book really would not have been possible, and it wouldn't have gotten the endorsements it got, and it wouldn't have actually changed the conversation if it wasn't like in the context of, for several years, actually gathering face to face a fairly large number of leading thinkers in theology and science. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
This is something too where I think that's good information for us at AI and Faith. I mean, I think one of the things that'd be really good is to find out if we could start to be gathering more, actually face to face at times. I mean, there's a role for virtual stuff, but there's also something important about doing an academic meeting, and that possibility. So I think what happened with that is that kind of like the more cooler heads that were more informed were able to get into a room and talk on a regular basis. There was a key meeting that happened at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for about 6 years. It was funded by JTF and had about 100 scholars every summer coming together to talk about this, including like big famous names and people you haven't heard of, but are actually, leading theologians. And actually, once again, just presenting to one another, trying to understand one another, airing out our disagreements and really getting to the core of what really was important to us. That ended up being like a really critical way how like a much more coherent approach to this was really formed. And I think that AI and Faith is really well positioned to be a place for that. And I think that's something that's really missing in this space right now. There isn't like a place to go where we can be doing that right now in AI and Faith, I would say. So with that, I mean, I'll talk about my book so you can understand how it was really surprising. And it's really, like I said, was only really possible because of this conversation that was happening with other scholars. And to a great deal, I credit them in making that possible, because I'm just a scientist. I didn't realize I would be writing a book on theology quite like this. My book, the first third of it is actually about science, and it has to do with clarifying a key point of science that was actually misunderstood. But when you understand that, you find out that even if evolution is true, now there's some people who think that evolution is false. And if you're one of those people, I'm not really trying to get into that argument. That's okay. You can disagree with me. But if it were true, then it's still possible with the science as we understand it, that Adam and Eve could have been de novo created without parents as recent as just 6,000 years ago and still be ancestors of everyone in the current theological era, at around 81. Now, that's a surprising thing that a lot of people didn't know. It takes about a third of a book to be able to explain it to non-experts exactly what's going on here, but it has to do with some proper distinctions between different types of ancestry. Genetic ancestry on one hand, which is what a lot of biologists had focused on and which seemed to be in deep conflict with the Genesis narrative. And then genealogical ancestry, which is a more ordinary understanding of ancestry that is more what theology is concerned with. But most theologians and scientists didn't even clearly separate in their mind those two different types of ancestry and thought that they were the same thing. And so that was like a fundamental source of conflict. And another major source of conflict that a lot of people didn't understand too in the conversation was that science doesn't actually have a definition of what human is. There's an immense amount of disagreement among scientists. It's something we care about. It's important. And it's certainly important in theology, but science doesn't really have a definition. And you can't really answer basic questions about like when humans arise or how they arise without actually having a good definition. So that adds a fundamental indeterminacy to what science is telling us, that made an immense amount of space for theological reflection and progress. And so I kind of found myself a little bit like a computational biologist, kind of translating between these two fields of theology and population genetics, and showing where there was points of contact and where there wasn't, and surprising a lot of people with how much space there really was for even a very literal reading in Genesis. And so that I think has ended up really shifting a lot of the lines in the origins debate and creating a lot of opportunity for a lot of good things to happen. So I'll say one thing that's common on a content level, I would say, between origins and AI is something called theological anthropology.
Okay.
And so it's questions like, what is the image of God? What's the nature of sin and the fall? These are things that are not just unique to the Christian faith, but you'll see it in all the Abrahamic religions. That's actually why Adam is important, because that's like a key story or narrative out of which there's key teachings that end up being very foundational understanding and understanding what it actually does mean to be human and how God relates to that. That's very closely connected to AI as well, as we start wondering about, whether or not AI could have a mind, whether or not I could ever be in the image of God, how it relates to a good dominion or not. And that's, I'd say, a key area where, especially those of us that are more scientifically or technically trained in AI, I think there's going to be a really long-term benefit to actually studying more deeply in theological anthropology.
No, I completely agree with you. And actually, on that same topic, there's many precisely different views in science out there about whether, for example, something like consciousness is computable or not, whether something, there's some scientists say it is computable, some scientists say it's not computable. And then you start precisely asking questions about, well, does that equal the mind? Because I think that some of the different misconceptions that are out there is that many people tend to believe like intelligence equals consciousness equals minds, and well, when perhaps they are different things. And precisely this thing that you're talking about, that theological anthropology can obviously shed some light on all this. So I wanted to ask you precisely, just to wrap up this part of the meeting on this on the AI field. How do you feel about these questions regarding consciousness? Or do you think that there's actually an answer to them? It's just, or is it about the question? Because in peaceful science, you also mentioned that sometimes it is about the question, and the question might lead us. So what do you think about that?
Well, yes, this is a great example where I think you can kind of see the reactionist approach arising, where some Christians, when they talk about this, they're certain that theology tells you that there is one negative answer to these questions. But I think the reality is that we don't really know what the answer to are three questions. One of them, is it possible for a machine to have a consciousness or be sentient? And if it is possible, how would we actually make a conscious machine? I don't think anyone really knows. And then three, if it's possible, and let's say we do figure out how, or if we do it accidentally, how would we know that we succeeded and actually created like a conscious machine? I think all three of those questions right now are wide open. And I don't think they're just wide open scientifically. I think they're also wide open theologically. And I think Noreen Hertzfeld's work is really good on that. And I mean, there's a lot more I could say about this. And that doesn't mean we should think it's high likelihood it would happen. I mean, maybe it's low likelihood. But I would say that we're already facing those sorts of questions in a very different way with things like ChatGPT. And, we can either kind of bunker down and kind of take a very kind of reactive, like self-protective sort of response to that. But I think there's a more fun and enjoyable approach, which is more open-handed. And that's kind of it's kind of raising those questions and entering into them and exploring them and seeing what a better good could look like. I'm not trying to say that we will see a conscious machine at any point. I'm saying that no one knows the answer to that, but our posture can be inviting to that conversation, right?
Yeah, I think this was a really, really wonderful time. I personally feel honored that I had the opportunity to ask you this many questions. This is, I think, what makes AI and Faith a great place to be, this exchange of ideas. Thank you so much, Josh.
That's great to meet you all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.